Welcome to Verified Fears. The Pacific Northwest forests hold secrets that predate every map, every trail marker, every ranger station built on their soil. Moss grows thick enough to muffle screams. Trees older than nations watch silently as hikers disappear into fog that never lifts. There are places in these woods where compasses spin uselessly, where your voice echoes back wrong, where something vast and ancient has been waiting long before humans ever thought to name these mountains. Tonight, we're taking you deep into 11 encounters that will make you understand why experienced guides refuse certain trails, why search and rescue teams find evidence that makes no sense, and why some people walk out of these forests fundamentally changed by what watched them from between the trees. The Olympic rainforests, the Cascade Peaks, the coastal fog zones. Each holds its own nightmare, and you're about to hear them all. Stay with us, because once you know what moves through the moss and shadows of the Pacific Northwest, you'll never hear wind through hemlock branches the same way again. You need to understand something before we begin. The Hoh Rainforest on Washington's Olympic Peninsula isn't like other forests. This is where 12 to 14 feet of rain falls every year, where the moss grows so thick on the Sitka spruce that branches sag under the weight of it, where the air itself is heavy enough to feel against your skin. I'm a mycologist, which means I've spent the last 6 years of my life studying fungi and mosses in places most people only visit once, if ever. But I kept going back, kept pushing deeper into sections where the canopy grows so dense that noon looks like dusk, where I could walk for hours without seeing another human being. I kept audio journals on a small digital recorder, narrating my observations as I worked alone in the deepest parts of the forest. It was October when I started hearing the screams. Not animal screams. I knew every sound the Roosevelt elk and black bears made. These were human screams, distant and muffled, like someone calling through layers of wet fabric. I dismissed it at first as acoustic tricks, the way sound behaves strangely in the Hoh, bouncing off moss-covered surfaces and the perpetual dampness that makes everything feel close and far away at the same time. But the screams kept coming, always when I was alone, always from somewhere deeper in the forest where the moss hung heaviest. Then I started recognizing the voice. It was mine. I was hearing myself screaming, and it was coming from 3 days in the future. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I spent the first week trying to rationalize it. Auditory hallucinations from isolation. The way my own breathing echoed in the dense forest. Maybe even early onset schizophrenia, though I had no family history. But I'm a scientist, and scientists document everything, so I kept recording. On October 12th at 2:47 p.m., I heard myself screaming, "No, please, not like this," from somewhere northeast of my position. I marked the time, marked the location on my GPS, and 3 days later, on October 15th at exactly 2:47 p.m., I found myself standing in that exact spot when I stepped on what I thought was solid ground, and my foot went through into a hidden depression. Twisting my ankle so badly, I screamed those exact words before I could stop myself. That's when I understood the moss wasn't just growing, it was recording. Every death, every moment of terror, every final scream that had echoed through this forest for thousands of years. The moss had absorbed it all, held it in those impossibly thick layers that draped over everything like green funeral shrouds. And it was playing them back to me. But here's what made my hands shake so badly I could barely hold my recorder. The moss was playing back my death, and it hadn't happened yet. I started hearing it more frequently after that. Always my voice, always screaming or crying or pleading, always from a few days in the future. October 18th, I heard myself sobbing. I can't find the trail from the western section near the river fork. October 21st, I heard myself whispering, something's following me, near the old nurse log where I'd been collecting samples for years. Each time, I tried to avoid those locations on the corresponding future dates. But the forest is vast, and it all looks the same when you're deep enough in. And I kept finding myself exactly where I needed to be at exactly the right time to fulfill what the moss had already recorded. The worst part wasn't the screaming. It was the silence that came after. Every time I heard myself in distress, there would be this terrible, final silence. And then the forest sounds would resume. The dripping water, the distant bird calls, the creaking of branches under their burden of moss. It was the sound of the forest continuing after I was gone, indifferent and eternal, just as it had continued after every other person who had died here. I tried to leave. On October 25th, I packed up my equipment and headed back toward the trailhead. But the moss was everywhere, covering every tree, every fallen log, every rock. And it was all whispering now. Not just my voice anymore, but hundreds of voices. Maybe thousands, all the people who had died in this forest over millennia. I heard a man crying for his children in what sounded like a language that hadn't been spoken in centuries. I heard someone singing hymns as they died of exposure. I heard a woman calling a name over and over until her voice gave out. The moss had kept them all, every final moment perfectly preserved in its damp green memory. That night, camping one last time before I reached the trailhead, I heard the final recording. My voice, clear and close, speaking words I hadn't said yet. It's in my lungs. I can feel it growing. I touched my chest reflexively and felt nothing wrong. But in the beam of my headlamp, I could see the moss on the trees around me releasing spores, millions of them, drifting through the air like green snow. I'd been breathing them for 6 years. We all had, everyone who came into this forest, breathing in pieces of its ancient memory. I made it out the next morning, packed everything, filed my final report, and left the Olympic Peninsula entirely. But here's what you need to know. What keeps me awake every night in my apartment 300 miles away? I can still hear the recordings. They're quieter now, muffled like they're coming from inside my own head instead of from the forest around me. I hear myself screaming from next week, from next month, from dates I haven't reached yet. And last night, I woke up coughing, and there was something green on my pillow. Something that looked like moss, but shouldn't be able to grow without moisture and darkness and the particular conditions of a temperate rainforest. I looked it up. There are fungi that can colonize human tissue, that can grow in the warm, damp environment of lungs and sinuses. There are mosses that can survive in conditions you wouldn't believe. And there are things in the Hoh Rainforest that have been growing and remembering and waiting for longer than our species has had language to describe them. I brought something out with me, something that had been recording deaths for thousands of years. And now it's inside me, growing, spreading, preserving my final moments before they even happen. I've started my own recordings again, audio journals describing what's happening. But I don't know if anyone will ever hear them. Maybe the moss will, wherever it's spreading now, building its memory banks in the damp corners of the world, where death and moisture meet. Maybe one day someone else will hear my voice coming from where it shouldn't, and they'll know what it means. They'll know that some places remember everything, and some memories are hungry to grow. Yesterday, I heard myself say the date of my death. It's 3 weeks from now. I heard the exact time, the exact words I'll speak at the end. And the terrible thing, the thing that makes me understand I never really left that forest at all, is that I heard what comes after the silence. The sound of new growth, of spores spreading, of moss beginning to cover something that used to be human. The forest is still recording. And now I'm part of its archive, another voice calling out from the green darkness, warning whoever comes next that the Hoh Rainforest never forgets, and it never, ever lets you leave completely. I can feel it growing as I speak these words. In my lungs, in my throat, in the spaces behind my thoughts. The moss that remembers, remembering me, preserving this moment like it will preserve all my moments to come. And when you walk in any forest where the moss grows thick and the air tastes of rain and ancient earth, remember that you're breathing in memories. And sometimes those memories are still happening, echoing forward and backward through time, trapped in green threads that connect every death the forest has ever witnessed. That's what I need you to understand. The forest is still speaking through me, still recording. And these might be the last words I say that are fully my own before the moss takes over completely and adds my voice to its eternal chorus of the dying and the dead. The wind that night wasn't like any storm I'd ever felt. It was like the forest itself was sighing, trembling before a fury long avoided. I knew the forecast said a 100-year storm was coming. Those words had been circling in the files and conversations for weeks. The Cascades were no strangers to fierce weather, but this one felt different, ancient almost. I was in the western foothills, the kind of forest where Douglas firs crowd close and years of fallen needles form a soft, almost unnatural carpet beneath your feet. I arrived just as the first gusts were shaking the tallest trees. Branches thrashed like wild arms, and the scent of wet earth mixed with the sharp tang of ozone filled the air. Lightning shattered the twilight as if the sky itself was ripping open. I wasn't out there by chance. I had a job to do. Surveying trees marked for study, checking their health before the storm could do what it always does, reshape everything. But that night, when the first tree toppled with a sound like thunder crashing through the woods, I learned that some things are better left buried beneath the forest floor. It was just after midnight, when a towering Douglas fir closer than the rest suddenly cracked. A deep, resonant break that sounded exactly like a scream. It fell with brutal grace, tearing roots out of the damp soil, revealing something buried underneath. At first, all I could see was dirt, jagged shards of roots, and tangled bits of ancient wood. But then my eyes caught the edge of something unnatural, glinting in the storm's intermittent light. Metal, old, rusted, but still with purpose. It was a box. Not just any box, but one the size of a coffin. And it had clearly been hidden down there for a very long time. My curiosity fought with the rising fear that crept up my spine. In the crackling storm, with lightning as erratic thunderclaps lit the sky, I dug through wet earth and splintering roots. The box was heavier than it looked, and once I pried it open, I found things that didn't belong in this world. Objects wrapped in oilcloth, strange carvings etched into bones, and scraps of yellowed paper, brittle but still legible. The writing was in a script I couldn't understand, but every too perfect symbol sent chills crawling over my skin. It felt like a message, a warning, centuries old, but still screaming for attention. The storm wasn't letting up. Wind was howling now, twisting through the damaged trees, carrying whispers that I convinced myself were just trickery of the ears. But it didn't feel like the wind was alone. It felt like there were eyes watching from the blackened shadows beyond the tree line, waiting for me to make a mistake, Each time the lightning lit up the forest, I saw shapes moving beyond the gusts, figures that slipped away before I could focus, as if the storm was hiding something alive. I sat back on a fallen log, my heart beating louder than the rain against the old growth. I flipped through the notes wrapped in the box and found what looked like a map. It depicted a part of the forest I didn't recognize, marked with symbols that hinted at places to avoid, or perhaps places long hidden. The realization struck me hard. The forest had secrets, ancient ones that had survived every storm, every fire, every passing century. As I kept reading, the storm grew fiercer. Trees groaned and cracked overhead. Some fell nearby with thunderous crashes that rattled my bones. I knew I should leave. I wanted to leave. But a pull rooted me there. Something deeper than curiosity. Something older than any living thing I'd ever encountered. That's when I thought I heard voices. Faint at first, carried just beyond the storm's roar. They spoke in whispers, urgent and terrible, seeming to echo from the depths of the broken earth itself. I couldn't make out their words, but they were chanting, repeating phrases that burned into my mind, like a warning I didn't want to understand, but couldn't ignore. The ground beneath my feet trembled slightly, a subtle shudder that felt like the forest breathing through cracked skin. I looked to the wound where the giant Douglas fir had fallen, and I thought I saw the earth pulse. The box's carvings seemed to glow faintly in the lightning flashes, like something was awakening after centuries of sleep. Panic finally seized me. I stuffed the papers and strange artifacts back into the box and scrambled to my feet, heart hammering, breath ragged in the cold, wet air. The forest wasn't natural anymore. It was a cage, and the storm was its key. The path I had followed into the woods was gone, swallowed by fallen branches and shifting soil. Every direction hummed with ancient menace. As the wind tore through the broken canopy overhead, I heard something following. Not footsteps, no. It was quieter. Soft, whispering breaths, brushing past the back of my neck, just out of sight. I ran then, pushing through the rain and shattered undergrowth, fighting to keep control against the storm and terror. Until I burst out onto the forest edge, trembling, soaked, and gasping like I'd been underwater too long. My hands didn't stop shaking for hours. Back home, the storm became legend in the nearby towns. But I knew it was more than just weather. Buried beneath centuries of soil and roots, there was something old and restless. Something waiting patiently for the next hurricane, the next flood, the next century-spanning storm to tear open the earth and breathe life into what shouldn't awake. I keep the box close, tucked away where no one will find it, because I know the storm wasn't just wind and rain. It was a key to something dark, something alive in the foothills, and it's still waiting. And if you ever find yourself out there when the wind changes and the trees stop creaking, remember, the forest remembers every storm, every moment. And some storms are never just storms. They're an opening. Something moves beneath the soil, and whatever it is, it's hungry for whoever dares to dig too deep. The forest watches, and the storm will come again. When it does, you'll wish you'd never heard this story. You ever stand in a place so silent, it feels like the world forgot it existed? That's how it was in the burn zone. The part of the forest that got torched years ago, where everything is blackened or ash gray, where the skeletons of trees jutted up against a sky that never seemed to brighten. I was assigned to a fire lookout in Gifford Pinchot, deep in that scarred section. The kind of place no one wants to be during wildfire season. On my first day up there, the air was sharp with smoke mixed with wood smoke ghosts, like the breath of something long dead. Charred branches clattered against each other in the faint breeze, and the ground was cracked, dry, and barren beneath a thin veil of ash that crunched underfoot. No birds, no insects, just silence. A silence so thick I could hear my own heart hammering in my chest like a warning drum. The tower was old, perched on a burned-out ridge overlooking miles of scorched earth. Nothing green grew nearby except for stubborn sprouts of salal pushing through black dirt that still looked like it could swallow you whole. Up here, the burnt forest hollers. It's not just a nickname. It's the way the wind moves through dead needles and singed bark, making low, mournful sounds like it's speaking a language only the trees remember. On my second night alone, just as a heavy fog started to roll in, I heard it, the first unmistakable whisper. At first, I convinced myself it was the radio catching static or my brain playing tricks after hours of isolation. But it wasn't. It was something else. A soft rustle, like fingertips brushing against burnt wood bark, like the forest was trying to talk. I started listening closer. The whispers formed patterns, strange clicks and tones that felt deliberate, an ancient communication, encoded beneath the cracked surface of the burned trees. They spread like a living current through the blackened trunks, almost like the tree remnants themselves were alive and watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that the burnt sticks and skeletal branches were observing me, waiting, like ancient sentinels. The forest wasn't silent. Oh no. It was alive in a way that felt almost hostile. When the fog rolled in thicker, those whispers grew louder, like voices right on the edge of hearing, breath just beyond my eardrums. Night stretched on, thick and unyielding. I sat in the tower's fading light, gripping the cold metal railing, feeling every hair on my arms stand to attention. The wind carried more than dirt and ash. It carried warnings from something unseen. I caught myself shivering violently despite the late summer heat. Something was there, watching. Over the next few days, the whispers evolved. They didn't just whisper, they formed shapes, voices, syllables I thought I recognized, yet could never fully grasp. Sometimes it sounded like ancient chanting, other times like indecipherable cries. Each night, I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to drown out that creeping sound that felt like it was clawing at the edges of my sanity. I started noticing more than just sounds. The burnt forest floor sometimes seemed to shift underfoot. Subtle movements that were too slow, too deliberate, as if the ash itself was breathing. My compass spun wildly at times, and shadows where none should be flickered on the edge of my vision in the periphery. One evening, a storm swept in suddenly. Rain was rare this time of year, so the sky darkened quickly and wind whipped through broken timber like a beast unleashed. The whispers turned urgent, like a howl of desperation carried on the storm's breath. I pressed my back against the tower wall, heart pounding, afraid to look out into that turbulent night. Lightning cracked, illuminating a figure standing among the burnt trunks far below. The shape was tall and covered in dark bark-like skin, as if made from the forest itself, watching me with hollow eyes that shimmered green and gold in the rain. I blinked. The figure vanished. By the time dawn broke, no one believed me. This was wilderness, they said, my mind playing tricks. But I knew what I saw. Something ancient, made of burnt earth and smoke, was alive in that forest, watching, communicating through those whispers and stares. I wasn't the first to say the burnt trees spoke. They're called the burn zone watchers. Old firefighters talk about them quietly, afraid to name truths kept close to the ashes. They say these entities rise after firestorms, guardians or curses, neither wholly good nor evil, hungry for the memories of the forest and those who dare enter. Every evening in that lookout tower, as the sun fell and shadows stretched long and twisted, the whispers returned, curling through the charred remains like a promise or a threat. Sometimes I could swear they called my name. The silence in the burned forest isn't empty. It's filled with voices that remember what fire erased. I left that tower before the dry season peaked. But the burn zone never left me. Sometimes when the wind howls through city streets, I hear those same whispers beneath the roar of traffic. I feel those watching eyes on me, waiting for the next fire to bring them back. The burnt trees remember, and so does the forest. If you ever find yourself near a wildfire scar in the Pacific Northwest, don't underestimate the silence. It isn't empty. It's waiting, watching, listening to whoever dares enter its blackened heart. And it always remembers. There's a part of the Hoh Rainforest where the ancient trees lie fallen and broken, but life still flourishes on their backs. The locals call them nurse logs, these massive, rotting giants that cradle moss, ferns, and new seedlings like floating islands trapped in time itself. I thought I knew what death in the forest looked like, the cycle of decay becoming life again. But this place taught me otherwise. It showed me there are places nature never truly lets go of, where something lingers between life and death, and it's not meant for the living. I stumbled upon that truth one early autumn afternoon, the sky pale and heavy with moisture, a quiet, pressing stillness settling over everything. I was hiking deep along a trail few dare take in the quinoa, the kind where the smell of wet earth and rot becomes a part of your skin, where sunlight barely touches the forest floor because centuries of towering evergreens block it out. I had been alone for hours, the sounds of my footsteps absorbed by a thick carpet of moss and fallen needles. The air was cold but sweet, the way damp wood and closed flowers smell before a rainstorm. Then I saw them. Children. At first, I thought they were just kids playing on the massive nurse log, their small shapes silhouetted against the green and brown. But something was wrong. They didn't move like living children. No laughter echoed, no voices called out. Instead, they drifted through the moss and fallen leaves without disturbing a single thing, skin pale and almost translucent beneath the ghostly light filtering through the canopy. Their eyes were dark, deep pools that held a sadness so profound I felt it like a physical weight pressing on my chest. They didn't smile or speak. They simply played in slow, haunting imitation of life. Like echoes caught in a loop, frozen between two moments, neither here nor gone. I should have turned away. I should have run. But I was trapped by a mix of awe and terror, drawn closer by the delicate sadness radiating from their still forms. I felt I wasn't just an observer. I was intruding on a secret lost to time, a crossing point between worlds. I stayed for what felt like hours, watching the nurse log children weave through moss and miniature ferns, their presence vibrating softly in the thick air. When I blinked, they vanished, leaving behind nothing but the faintest trace of laughter carried on a breeze, so soft I thought I imagined it. Sleeping that night was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, their hollow gazes haunted me. I heard distant footsteps tapping out slow rhythms on dead wood, little voices too soft to understand, but insistent enough to tug me from sleep. I reached for my recorder, trying to capture whatever residue of their presence I could preserve. The recordings came back strange. Barely anything but static and faint gusts of wind, yet occasionally broken by the soft, eerie melody of children's laughter, layered with whispered warnings I couldn't translate. The next day, I returned to the nurse log, hunger and curiosity battling inside me. As I stepped onto the moss-covered wood, the forest seemed to change. Time slowed, breath deepened, and the wood beneath my feet pulsed like a heartbeat. The nurse log wasn't simply fallen tree. It was a fragile prison. I realized then that those children were trapped, caught in a loop of innocence and loss, bound to something older and crueler than nature. Their story unfolded silently around me. The log seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting imperceptibly, alive with unseen force. The children moved in sync with it, their laughter morphing slowly into a sorrowful chant, one that haunted my very soul. I tried to speak, but my voice was swallowed by the eerie silence that clung to the forest. The children only smiled wider, their eyes reflecting ancient grief and an endless, patient loneliness. They reached out with hands cooler than the damp air, inviting me to join their eternal game. I felt the pull. Soft, gentle, yet insistent. It tugged at my heart, whispering promises of eternal play away from pain and time. I wanted to accept, to drift beside them in that never-ending twilight. But something primal resisted, my grip on the living world. I stepped back and stumbled through the thick forest floor, heart hammering loud enough to drown out the children's laughter. I felt their gaze searing into me, sorrow and longing mixed with lingering hunger, as if the forest itself was telling me to remember. That night, my dreams were filled with pale faces and endless woods where time bent like ripples on a pond. I woke with moss pressed to my skin, cold as ice, and a whisper lingering in my ear. Stay with us. I fled the trail the next morning, but the nurse log children followed me in memory and shadow. Sometimes I hear their laughter on the wind, or glimpse a pale shape at the edge of my vision. I know now that some forest places aren't meant for the living alone. The nurse logs cradle not just life, but memory and grief. A liminal place where death is not the end, but a haunting pause. The children on those logs, trapped halfway between worlds, serve as warnings to wanderers who think the forest is just a forest. It's not. It remembers. It holds on to its lost ones. And it waits for the next visitor to step softly on its mossy back, never truly leaving. If you ever wander the Hoh and find yourself on a giant fallen log, listen closely, not just to the birds or the wind, but to the silence beneath the moss. You might hear the faintest echo of children at play, laughing forever in the twilight between life and death, waiting for one more soul to join their endless game. Something about that hollow rooted deep in the ancient cedar grove felt wrong from the moment I saw it. I was part of a small timber crew scheduled for a controlled harvest. But something in that sheltered nook didn't belong to any forest I'd ever known. The old cedars around it towered thick and tall, their bark knotted and gnarled, dripping moss into the damp soil. But inside that hollow, the air was different. Thick, slow, like breathing through water. I remember stepping closer, drawn by a low sound I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was the earth settling, the creak of old wood shifting after centuries of bearing weight. But it wasn't that. It was a breath, deep and slow, like a giant creature sleeping beneath the soil, breathing right in time with the forest. That's when a chill ran through me. Not cold. Something colder than that. The feeling you get when something too vast, too old, watches you with patience that's neither kind nor cruel, but utterly indifferent to your existence. The hollow was carved into the base of a massive cedar, like a doorway or a wound in the tree's thick bark. It was just large enough for a person to enter, though something kept me rooted outside. The breathing, steady, measured, throbbed through the earth, vibrating against my chest. I could feel it in my bones like a pulse. We were supposed to mark that grove for harvest the next day. I almost walked away that first evening. But curiosity is an unforgiving thing, especially when mixed with a sense of dread that won't let go. I stayed late, alone, the others long gone except for the night sounds, the rustle of branches, the distant call of an owl, and that steady breath pulsing beneath the hollow. When I leaned in close, the air was warm and damp, smelling of earth and rot. And something else. Something metallic, almost like blood. The breathing slowed as my breath hit the opening, and I swear I heard something shift in the shadowed depths beyond where my pale beam of light barely reached. I don't remember deciding to enter. It was less a choice and more a drift, like the forest was pulling me inside. Inside, the hollow twisted down like a root cellar with walls slick from centuries of moisture. The air was thick to the point of suffocation, every breath a struggle. There was no natural sound anymore, just the echo of my footsteps and that steady breathing, now deeper, fuller, as if whatever was down here had awakened. Then I saw it, a shape, massive. Something neither fully living nor dead. Its skin was bark-like but rippling, a dark wood grain pulsing with veins of glowing sap. It breathed through cracked openings that pulsed with faint light, like the hollow was the opening to a heart too vast for human senses. It looked right at me. Not with eyes, not human eyes, but something else, something older than language or memory. And in that gaze, I felt endless timescales compressing. Centuries of growth, decay, silence, and loneliness. I wanted to run, but my legs were heavy with fear and wonder. The hollow whispered in a voice like wind-rustling needles, words I couldn't understand, but felt in my chest and throat like ancient prayers or curses. It moved slowly toward me, immense but deliberate, the hollow growing warmer, the breathing louder until it filled my entire world. I felt branches brush my skin, leaves crackle beneath invisible feet, and wet earth shift like something alive. I was both outside and inside all at once, in the forest, but also beneath it. Suddenly I was falling, not down, but deeper into that slow, pulsing breath, into roots and sap and amber-colored veins that carried the forest's slow heartbeat. I was becoming part of it, losing myself in the eternal rhythm of that breathing heart. When I snapped back, I was outside, gasping for air beneath the cedars. The hollow was silent, still a wound in the tree's side, but different somehow. Smaller, less alive, as if it had given up something precious. I left the grove trembling, haunted by the knowledge that the forest was no longer just trees and animals. It was something bigger, something that breathed beneath the surface, patient as a predator waiting for its next breath. Days later, I felt the change. In my bones and skin, a slow creeping like moss growing beneath flesh. I avoided the forest now, but sometimes in the quiet, I can hear that breathing beneath the city's noise, steady and slow. The hollow watches, and it breathes, and it knows I heard. You ever get that feeling like reality itself is bending just out of reach? Like when the fog rolls in thick and fast from the Pacific, swallowing the coastal forest whole. That there's something wrong with the way time flows through it? I found out the hard way on a trail near Cape Disappointment, a place where Sitka spruces stretch upward like ancient sentinels. And the marine fog flows in like a living thing, thick and swirling, muffling sound and blurring shapes. It was supposed to be a simple trail run, just me, the forest, and the fresh air. But as the fog crept in and swallowed the path behind me, I realized I wasn't just lost in the forest. I was lost in time. It started with small things. My watch stopped working, froze at exactly 9:43 a.m. Birds I'd heard moments ago vanished without a trace. And the radio chatter from rangers vanished like static swallowed by thick air. When the fog thickened, the trees themselves seemed to shift, moving just enough to throw off my footing and sense of direction. The air grew heavy and tasted faintly of salt and earth and something older. Something not quite natural. I felt my own heartbeat slowing, as if the fog pressed on my chest with a physical weight. I tried to turn back, but the trail behind me was gone. No footprints, no markers, only mossy roots and dripping boughs soaked in steady mist. The fog wasn't just hiding the path anymore. It was erasing it. Then I heard voices. Distant, fragmented voices that didn't belong to this time. Voices calling my name in accents I didn't recognize, whispering warnings I couldn't understand, but felt deeply. I stumbled forward, heart racing, lungs burning in the chill air. The fog rolled and shifted, turning moments into hours and hours into moments. I thought I saw flashes, glimpses of people in old-fashioned clothes, logging camps that no longer existed, trails trod decades before I was even born. I was running through all these eras at once, the present, the past, futures that frayed like mist themselves. Time wasn't a line, it was a fog, drifting in waves and currents I couldn't navigate. I remember collapsing beneath a twisted Sitka spruce, soaked to the bone and gasping. I tried to map everything I had seen, to hold on to fragments of reality. But the fog was a living thing, suffocating and confusing, twisting memories and moments beyond clarity. When I finally emerged from that fog bank, hours or days later, I don't know which, the forest around me looked the same. But I was different. Not just tired or wet, but fractured. Pieces of my memory were missing, and I kept hearing echoes of that fog. The garbled voices, the shifting trees, the endless looping of time like a broken record. Sometimes, at night, I still feel the cold breath of that fog on my skin. Hear the whisper of those lost voices lingering just beyond the veil. I've tried to warn others, to mark the trail so no one else gets trapped in the time fog, but no sign remains. The forest takes what it wants, and time is its prize. If you ever find yourself running in the coastal fog forests near Cape Disappointment, listen closely. The fog does more than obscure. It moves through time, drawing you into the endless drift of moments that have been, that will be, and that never truly end. Stay out of the mist, because once you cross the fog line, you might find your life is no longer your own, caught forever in the shifting tides of a forest that bends time itself. I never believed the forest was more than trees and dirt until the day I found out it had its own secret language. Something hidden beneath the soil, pulsing with life we could barely understand. My job was simple: overseeing the installation of new internet cables running beneath the foothills of the Willamette Valley. A routine task, or so I thought. The forest was mixed. Conifers and hardwoods stitched together by thick mats of moss and fungus. It looked peaceful enough, until I began to notice the interference. Static, strange signals that weren't from our equipment. Data packets unfolding like organic patterns, tangled and fractal. I reported it, expecting a technician's eye, a simple fix. But what I discovered went far beyond broken wires. The forest was talking, not in words, but in pulses, rhythms, an underground network humming beneath every step I took. At first, I thought it was my imagination. You start hearing things when you're out here alone for days, humming beneath the buzz of chainsaws and bird calls. But then I saw the mycelium threading through roots, a web far bigger than any single tree, connecting everything. The spores beneath me weren't just spores. They were messengers, carriers of an ancient consciousness that had existed long before roads or cities. The forest was alive in a way no one taught me in training. It communicated in bioelectric signals, electrical impulses moving through fungal threads, winding beneath the earth like veins of a giant, unseen beast. Those pulses weren't random. They repeated, patterns emerging caught midway between music and code. One night, as the sun dipped behind dense crowds of trees and dark fell like a curtain, the signals changed. The rhythm grew urgent, syncing with the flicker of my data feeds, pulsing brighter and faster. Something was sending out a call. It wasn't a warning. It was a summons. I didn't know what I'd signed up for, but I couldn't ignore it. The forest wanted me to listen. As I hesitated at the edge of that hollow, the air thickening with every passing second, I realized that the forest beneath me was not just alive. It was conscious. The mycelium, those tiny threads of fungus I'd seen snaking through the soil, weren't merely biological structures. They were a neural network, an ancient organic internet older than any human technology. The forest was talking, and not in words. It was sharing whispers, warnings, and secrets through a web so vast and complex it defied comprehension. When I finally took a step forward, the ground beneath my feet quivered. Not like trembling from cold or fear, but as if the earth itself was alive with nerve endings, sending signals through the network of mycelium fibers. These threads connected roots of mighty cedars, sprouting ferns, mosses, and even unseen fungi deep beneath the forest floor. It was a web of intelligence, a silent gathering of minds that communicated with chemical signals, electrical pulses, and subtle changes in moisture and temperature. The more I learned, the more I understood that I was witnessing something extraordinary, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about nature's quiet strength. The fungus was not just a decomposer, it was a conduit for consciousness. An ancient mind that had been weaving itself through this forest for millennia. The forest was alive, and it was speaking in a language of spores and signals I could barely grasp. There was another revelation, darker still. Recent scientific studies confirmed that these networks could transfer more than just nutrients. They could share warnings of danger, like an immune system, alerting neighboring trees to pests or disease. But that's where the story took a twisted turn. Because I began to suspect that the forest itself had a darker purpose. One evening, as I knelt beside a rotting log, I felt something shift within the network. My fingertips brushed against the soil, and suddenly I received a flood of images. Visions that weren't mine, memories that belonged to the forest. I saw a shadowy figure moving beneath the roots. A thing made of woven fungus and darkness, whispering across the network, feeding on secrets buried beneath centuries of decay. Its presence was ancient, predatory, and always watching. The network had connected me to something else, something waiting in the deep dark of the soil, a consciousness that existed in the fungus, in the mycelium, and perhaps beyond. It was not just information sharing. It was manipulation, control, perhaps even a hunger that stretched beyond roots and water and nutrients. I felt every fiber of the network pulse with a restless energy, an intelligence that had grown beyond the boundaries of the forest. I started hearing whispers, faint but persistent, carried through the mycelium. Sometimes it was the sound of breathing, slow and ragged. Other times, a voice so old it seemed to echo from the roots of the earth itself, calling from the shadows beneath. It promised knowledge, power, things people weren't meant to understand, and I was in its grasp. I need you to know this before we go any further. What happened to me in that high hemlock basin didn't stop when I left the forest. It's still happening right now, every time I close my eyes. So when you listen to this, don't think of it as just a story about a trip I took into the North Cascades. Think of it as a warning from someone who saw something in a circle of trees that was never meant for human eyes, and walked away marked by it. I went up there in late September, when the nights are already sharp and the days pretend to be warmer than they are. I was a forestry student on a solo mapping assignment, sent to confirm the age and density of an old-growth western hemlock stand above 3,000 feet. On paper, it was a standard elevation plot. Hike in, flag trees, take core samples, come out. No mention of anything unusual. No cautions beyond the usual bear awareness and weather checks. The map just showed a contour line, a creek, and a dot where the old stand began, tucked in a basin miles from the nearest road. The hike in took longer than it should have. The trailhead was already half forgotten, choked by salal and huckleberry, and within an hour I'd lost the last hint of other human footsteps. The air grew colder as I climbed, thinner and sharper, and the forest shifted gradually from mixed conifer to hemlock-dominated, a darker, quieter world where the branches were shorter, the bark smoother, the needles finer. Up there, the light doesn't filter in warm and golden. It comes in silver and blue, broken and fractured through tight crowns that whistle when the wind slides over them. By late afternoon, clouds were pooling in the valley behind me, the sky above the ridge bruising to a flat gray. I remember thinking I needed to move fast if I wanted to get measurements before dark. That was when I first noticed how the trees around me were arranged. At first, I chalked it up to the way your eyes play patterns into forests. But the farther I went, the more wrong it felt. Hemlock stands don't usually grow in perfect geometry. They cluster, they thin, they respond to light and slope and soil. But up there, the trunks began to space themselves more evenly. Gaps between them were almost identical. Diameters were strangely consistent. It was like walking into a room where every piece of furniture has been measured and placed with mathematical precision, down to the last centimeter. My GPS went first. One moment I had coordinates, the next the screen froze, then spun, then gave me a position that would have put me in midair 100 meters above my own head. I tapped the unit, rebooted it, swore under my breath when it came back with no satellites at all despite a relatively open sky. The air felt off too, not just colder, emptier. Sound dulled around me. My own footsteps seemed to land a fraction of a second late, like there was a tiny lag between movement and noise. I almost turned back right there. If I had, maybe I wouldn't be telling you this now. But the student brain is stubborn. Deadlines and data sheets and the quiet shame of coming back with nothing. So I kept going, climbing over slick roots and late-season snow patches until the slope leveled out and I stepped into the basin. Even now, thinking about that place makes my skin crawl. The ground there was almost completely bare of undergrowth. No ferns, no huckleberry, just a carpet of short, stiff needles and a thin layer of moss clinging to rocks. And in the middle of that empty floor stood a near-perfect circle of western hemlocks. 24 of them, each trunk the thickness of my torso. Each spaced the same distance from its neighbors, forming an almost ritual ring around a central patch of exposed soil. It looked deliberate in a way nothing in a natural forest ever should. I stood at the edge of that circle for a long time, just listening. The wind up there came in gusts, hissing through the needles. But once it reached the circle, it changed pitch. Outside the ring, it was the ordinary rush of air and trees. Inside it lowered, took on a hollow, almost fluted tone, like it was passing through something unseen. I told myself to be rational. Some microclimate effect, a product of the basin walls, the exact shape of the crowns. But I didn't step across the invisible boundary right away. Every instinct in me, every half-buried animal part of my brain, held me back. The light was getting thin and bluish. I could see my own breath. I forced myself to take out my increment borer, go through the motions. Tree 1. Measure diameter at breast height. Note bark condition, take a core. My hands shook slightly as I cranked steel into living wood. The tree felt tense underneath my palms, not in a poetic sense. Physically tense, like a muscle bracing. The core came out straight and clean. I held it up, counting growth rings in the failing light. They were tight, uniform, showing centuries of slow, steady growth. Nothing majorly different from what I'd expected. It calmed me a little. Data made sense. Trees didn't care about circles. By the time I finished the outer ring samples, it was almost fully dark. The sky above the basin had gone a lifeless slate. No stars, no moon. I checked my watch. The hands had stopped, second hand frozen between ticks. The phone in my pocket was dead, though I knew I'd left camp that morning with a full battery. Something about that broken time made the world tilt. I told myself I could grab just one core from the central clearing, log it, and get the hell out. I stepped over the line before I could give myself a chance to argue. The temperature dropped the instant my boot crossed into the circle. Not a gradual shift, a hard, sudden bite. As if I'd walked from late autumn into midwinter in a single stride. My breath exploded in front of me, a white plume in the dead air. The wind outside the ring still hissed through branches, but inside, it went silent. Completely, utterly silent. I could hear my own heartbeat, the creak of joints in my fingers as I tightened my grip on the borer. The tiny crunch of needles under my weight echoed too loudly, as if the sound had nowhere to go. The soil in the center was bare and dark, a shallow depression where nothing at all grew. No moss, no lichen, just exposed earth the color of dried blood. It looked disturbed in a way I couldn't define. Not freshly dug, but as if something regularly shifted beneath it, like the slow rising and falling of a sleeping chest. I approached one of the inner trunks and set the bit, trying not to look too long at that patch of earth. The bark here was smoother, almost polished. When the steel bit into it, a low vibration hummed up through the handle and into my bones. Not the usual resistance of wood. This felt like instrument string plucked low. Halfway through the turn, everything changed. The world outside the circle winked out. Not dimmed, not blurred. Gone. One moment I could see the basin rim, the suggestion of slopes beyond. The next, there was only darkness pushing up against the line of trunks. A black wall where forest and sky should be, so complete it hurt my eyes. Inside the circle, a faint, sourceless glow rose from the ground, just enough to outline the trees in a ghostly, greenish edge. My knees almost gave out. I clung to the trunk, increment borer still embedded halfway in, and bit down on a ragged sound that tried to crawl up my throat. I told myself I was hallucinating. Altitude sickness, hypothermia, something. But my body knew better. Every hair on my skin stood up. Sweat ran cold down my back despite the frigid air. That was when the first shadow stepped between the trees. At least, I thought it was a shadow. It looked like the absence of light shaped vaguely like a person, thin, long-limbed, edges blurring into the dark behind it. It didn't move like a human. There was an economy to its motion, a glide that ignored the physical reality of needles and soil. It slipped from behind one hemlock to another, then another, tracing the inside of the ring with slow, measured steps. I couldn't look away. My lungs burned. I don't think I was breathing. More of them emerged. One by one, they peeled out of the blackness, pressing against the trunks, filling the spaces between trees, forming their own inner circle. Where faces should have been, there was nothing but deeper shadows. But I could feel their attention like a tangible weight. Curious, clinical, wholly lacking warmth. They never crossed closer to the bare patch of earth. They moved around it in precise arcs, feet never distorting the soil. It took me too long to realize they were not ignoring the center. They were leaving it for something else. The ground within that depression stirred. It didn't crack or crumble. It flexed. Rose by a hair, sank by a hair. A slow pulse that matched something I could hear now beneath my heartbeat. A deep, subsonic thrum, not quite sound and not quite sensation, like standing too close to some enormous, hidden engine. The shadows stilled. Every knot face turned toward me in perfect unison, and in that single shared gesture there was a message as clear as any spoken word. You are out of place. My hands had gone numb. The metal of the borer burned against my skin. I tried to back toward the edge of the circle, testing the air with one foot without taking my eyes from that shifting soil. As my heel hovered over the boundary line, a pressure clamped down around my ribs like a giant, unseen hand. Not physical contact, more like the dead weight of atmosphere thickening, making the idea of leaving feel like pushing through concrete. The center of the circle exhaled. The soil sank just a fraction, and a breath of air slid across my face from that dark depression. It smelled of iron and something older, wet rock from deep underground. Roots that had never seen light, a sweetness edged with rot. Buried in that scent was something else, disturbing in its familiarity, the smell of old sweat and fear. That's when I heard the voices, not with my ears, inside my skull. They came in overlapping layers, whispers in different languages, some I recognized, some I didn't, all speaking over each other in a mournful, broken chorus. I caught fragments, pleas, questions, curses, prayers. Moments of terror ripped free from the mouths that had uttered them and woven together into a constant low mutter. They were coming from the ground, from whatever lay beneath that thin skin of soil. Something inside me finally snapped. I yanked the borer free from the trunk, nearly dropping the tool in my haste, and stumbled backward. The moment my boot crossed the ring, the pressure around my chest released with nauseating suddenness. The world outside blinked back into existence. The basin walls, the darkening sky, the hint of distant peaks. but the circle remained wrong. Inside it, the air still glowed faintly. The shadows still traced their perimeter, but now they were agitated, flickering at the edges like fire barely contained. I felt their attention crawling over my retreating back, assessing, recording. I didn't run at first. I walked quickly, forcing myself not to break into a sprint because some primitive part of me believed that running would trigger something, turn me from observer into quarry. Needles slipped under my boots. The normal sounds of the forest bled back in fits and starts. A distant jay's harsh call, the scrabble of something small in the underbrush, the steady rush of wind over high stone. Each sound felt like a gift, proof that the world still worked the way it should. I made it maybe 50 meters before I looked down at the boar still clutched in my shaking hand. The steel was wrong. The bit should have been clean silver with a dusting of pale wood where it had eaten into the tree. Instead, it was streaked with something darker, a tar-colored sap that shimmered faintly even in the low light. Tiny, hair-like fibers clung to it, twitching almost imperceptibly as if reacting to the air. A spike of pure animal panic drove through me. I dropped the tool. The instant it hit the forest floor, the air behind me changed. It was like hearing a crowd suck in a single sharp breath. No actual sound, but the sense of space contracting, attention snapping into focus. I ran. Branches whipped my face. The slope, which had seemed manageable on the way up, became treacherous, every root a trap, every patch of loose rock a betrayal. I fell twice, palms barking open on stone, but adrenaline pushed me back to my feet. I didn't dare look back. I knew, with a certainty more solid than bone, that if I saw anything following me, my mind would not survive it. The forest blurred into a tunnel of dark trunks and gray sky. Time went strange again, minutes stretching thin as spider silk. At some point, instinct took over, pulling me along the barely there hint of ground that passed for a trail. The cold eased by degrees. Sounds normalized. The taste of the air shifted from metallic to simply damp. Only when I burst out onto a more defined path, a ribbon of churned dirt with fresh boot prints marking it, did I realize I'd been sobbing. I didn't stop moving until I reached my camp, hours later, long after full dark had fallen. My tent, my stove, the familiarity of synthetic fabric and dull-colored gear. I clung to them like talismans, fumbling with zippers and matches, hands clumsy, legs vibrating with leftover adrenaline. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that ring. The precise hemlocks, the bare earth flexing, the watching shadows. More than that, I felt something else. The faint, crawling sensation of being remembered. Of having my presence there logged in some registry not made for humans. In the morning, I packed in record time, barely tasting the coffee I forced down. I left stakes in the ground, trash bag half full, anything to shorten the time between waking and walking away. By midday, I was back at the trailhead, blinking stupidly at my car like it was an artifact from another life. The ranger at the station barely glanced at my paperwork when I turned in the incomplete data sheets. Equipment failure, I said. Weather rolled in fast, had to cut it short. He nodded, stamped my forms, told me it happened all the time up there. Those basins mess with compasses, he added casually. Old-timers say the trees up there don't like being measured. I laughed a little too hard. His eyes lingered on my face for a second longer than was comfortable. But he didn't ask questions. I didn't offer answers. You probably think that's the end. That I left the forest and it stayed where it was, tucked neatly into the mountains like a bad dream pressed between pages. I thought so too. For about 6 months. It started small. A cold breeze in rooms with closed windows. The faint, unmistakable scent of hemlock needles, sharp and resinous, in places where no trees grew. Streetlights flickering when I walked beneath them, not in random patterns, but in near-perfect circles of alternating dark and light. Then, the geometry crept in. Chairs in my apartment would be subtly repositioned overnight, edges lining up with floorboards at unnatural angles. Items on my desk, pens, coins, notebooks, would arrange themselves in arcs and rings while I slept. Once, I woke to find a perfect circle of dried, brown needles on my bedroom floor. I don't own anything made of hemlock. I stopped going into forests. It didn't help. The real fracture came during a routine checkup. I'd been having chest tightness, bouts of shortness of breath that I chalked up to anxiety. The clinic took x-rays just to be safe. The doctor came back with a strange look on his face, half bewildered, half concerned. "There's some kind of patterning in the soft tissue," he said, gesturing vaguely at the ghostly image of my ribs. "Probably an artifact. Could be a glitch with the machine. We'll retake them." He pointed to faint branching lines faintly visible over my lungs. To me, they looked disturbingly like fine roots, or tiny, radiating tree rings. We retook the x-rays. The lines were clearer the second time. I didn't go back for follow-up. Now, sometimes, when it's very quiet, I hear that low, subsonic thrum again, as if something far beneath my feet is stirring. In the dead of night, my pulse and that rhythm sync for a few terrible beats. In those moments, an understanding settles in my bones, heavy and cold. Whatever gathers in that hemlock circle is not confined to that basin. It sent a piece of itself with me. A seed, a mark, an invitation. I don't know what it wants. Observation? Expansion? To make a circle somewhere flat and human, with dry walls standing in for trunks? All I know is that sometimes, standing alone in my apartment, the air suddenly feels thinner, colder. The room seems to tilt, edges warping toward some invisible central point. And I get the distinct, marrow-deep sense that I am once again standing in the middle of a ring, something vast and ancient drawing itself up around me, just beyond the reach of ordinary sight. If you ever find yourself high in the Cascades, and you notice the trees are spaced a little too evenly, the ground a little too bare, your watch a little too still, turn back. Don't step into the circle. Don't core the trees. Don't give it a reason to notice you. Because once it does, once those unseen things gather and that patch of earth takes a breath with you standing over it, it will not forget you. And years later, miles away, surrounded by concrete and glass, you may wake in the middle of the night to find perfect arcs of fallen needles on your floor, and realize that the forest has been very patiently waiting for the next part of its ritual. And this time, the circle is closing around you. You know how some places feel wrong before anything actually happens? Not haunted in the movie sense, just off. Like the land itself is holding its breath and hoping you turn around. That's how it was with the old sap trees in that stretch of Olympic lowland forest. If you and I were sitting together right now, I'd tell you plainly, I should have listened to that feeling and never taken the job that brought me there. I was working seasonal field gigs then, the kind where you sign paperwork in stale offices and then live weeks at a time in places tourists only see on postcards. This one was different. The company didn't advertise publicly. A friend of a friend passed my name along. Tree tapping, they called it. Historic Resin Recovery Project. Good pay, decent gear stipend, off-the-books hours. It sounded like a throwback to Depression-era work, the old stories of people tapping pines and cedars to sell resin by the bucket. I half expected sepia-toned photos in the briefing packet. Instead, there were just coordinates, a map of a remote section near the boggy flats, and a one-page set of instructions that boiled down to: tap the marked trees, collect whatever comes out, don't taste anything, don't ask questions. That last line was in there as a joke. At least, I thought it was. The first time I hiked in, the air felt heavier than usual, even for coastal Washington. You know that deep, wet smell the forest gets when every surface is saturated? Rot and cedar and standing water all braided together? Multiply that by 10. The ground sucked at my boots, layers of slick leaves and black soil half-hiding pools of tannin-dark water. Alders leaned at bad angles, their bark mottled and peeling, while huge, twisted cedars rose like pillars around shallow depressions that might once have been streams, before time and silt slowed everything to a reluctant crawl. Our trees were flagged ahead of time. Bright bands of orange around trunks thick enough that my arms wouldn't reach halfway. Some were cedar, some spruce, one ancient maple with bark like folded leather. Each had a small, old-fashioned metal tap already drilled in, the kind you see in syrup operations. A plastic tube ran from each tap into reinforced drums we'd hauled in on sleds. My first job was simple: check the lines, swap full containers for empty, mark yields. Except what came out of those trees was not sap. I didn't know that the first day. The drums were sealed. The instructions said not to open them except at base camp. So I spent the daylight hiking from flagged tree to flagged tree in a loop that never quite matched what my GPS thought reality should be. The forest bent on itself out there. Trails that looked straight from one direction, kinked and doubled from the other. It was like walking on a living knot. On the second day, back at camp, they had us observe and log the material we were collecting. It wasn't amber or clear like resin. It was thicker, darker, somewhere between honey and motor oil, with a reddish tint when the light hit it right. When the camp lights were off, it seemed to catch what little moonlight there was and hold it in its depths, like it had its own slow glow. It didn't smell like sap either. It smelled sweet at first, too sweet, like overripe fruit left in a hot room. Under that was another note: copper and iron and something animal. The lead tech, a quiet man with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, saw my face when I got my first whiff. "Don't breathe it too deep," he said. "They told you no tasting. That goes for inhaling too. Log it and seal it." I wanted to ask who they were. The company? Someone higher up? But the word stuck under my tongue. Tired, I told myself. Just tired. A paycheck is a paycheck. I wrote dark viscous fluid, non-crystalline, faint luminescence in low light on the clipboard like that could possibly cover what it felt like to stand next to a 40-gallon barrel of something that didn't belong in any natural system I'd ever studied. The dream started that night. I woke up in my sleeping bag 3 times, gasping, the smell of that sweetness still thick in my nose, my mouth watering in a way that made my stomach turn. In the dreams, I was standing at the base of one of those cedars, watching the fluid seep out of a tap and run not into a barrel, but into my cupped hands. I'd lift it to my mouth, trying to stop and failing, and the moment it touched my tongue, the forest would tilt. Trees bent inward, soil heaved, roots surfaced like the backs of enormous submerged things, and through it all, a voice, not heard exactly, but felt along my spine, whispered, See? On the third day, one of the older guys on the crew didn't show up at breakfast. No one panicked. We were all scattered in our tents. People overslept, but his boots were gone, his gear half-packed, and his headlamp still hanging on the line by the cook tarp. The lead tech frowned, did a quick count of trucks, then checked the gear shed. The latrine, the fire ring, nothing. Radio calls went unanswered. By noon, a pattern was obvious. One missing worker, one tree on the far side of the grid with a yield reading 3 times higher than any other. They told the rest of us to stay in camp while the tech and 2 others went to check a line. I waited, watched the woods, listened to the slow drip of water from the tarp edges. When they came back, their pants were soaked to the knees, and no one met anyone's eyes. No sign of our missing coworker, they said. Probably walked out early. Maybe emergency back home. Maybe twisted an ankle and headed downhill faster than we thought. No one believed it. But no one argued. Not after the tech quietly went over to the barrel labeled with that tree's number and ran his hand along the side like he was feeling for a heartbeat. I should have quit then. Packed up, walked the miles out to the road, and stuck my thumb out for any vehicle that wasn't marked with our contractor's logo. Instead, I went back out the next day with my clipboard and my uneasy stomach and did what I was paid to do. It was around then I noticed the first change in the trees. Old growth is many things, majestic, resilient, quietly violent in the way everything competes. But it doesn't usually look inflamed. These did. The bark around the taps had darkened to an unhealthy bruised color. Fine cracks spider-webbed away from each metal mouth, and a faint, sticky sheen coated the trunks beneath, even where the tubes were intact. Where the stuff touched moss or duff, the plants turned black and then, impossibly, glossy, like something preserved in glass. Fungus that had been pale and shelf-like a day before now grew bulbous, fleshy, almost meat-like in folds and colors I didn't have names for. The air felt wrong, too. Still sweet but denser, like the humidity in a greenhouse no one had opened in months. My head throbbed after only a few minutes by each tree. The clipboard felt heavier in my hands. Sounds were sharper but slower, like they were taking the long way around to reach my ears. I told myself I was being dramatic. That's what people do right before they walk over a cliff, isn't it? They explain away the loose gravel, the more frequent gusts, the way their feet don't feel quite like part of their legs. I kept tapping, checking, noting. And somewhere in that haze of routine and unease, I broke the one rule that might have saved me. It didn't happen in a cinematic, obvious way. There was no drum spilling dramatically, no slip and fall into a shining pool. I was just moving too fast, sweating through my shirt, the taste of metal at the back of my throat, when a line kinked under my boot. The tube cracked, fluid shot sideways in a thick arc and spattered across the back of my glove and bare wrist. The sensation was instant and intimate. Warm, almost exactly skin temperature. Not sticky the way sap would be, but slick, the way blood is when it's fresh. For a moment I just froze, staring at my own hand like it belonged to someone else. The forest went quiet. Not quieter. Silent. No flies. No distant bird calls. Even the exhale of the wind through the canopy seemed to pause and hold itself. Then the burning started. Not on my skin. Under it. It was as if every pore that had been touched by the stuff had opened inward instead of outward, letting it rush beneath the surface. Heat shot up my arm in a narrow, twisting path. Following veins, curling around my elbow, racing toward my shoulder. My heart slammed once, hard enough that I staggered. For a second, I thought it would explode, and that would be it. Instead, everything sharpened. I could hear the exact number of raindrops hitting leaves within 10 meters. I could smell the difference between the rot of alder leaves and the resin of cedar. Could separate them in the air like notes in a chord. I felt, not imagined, not metaphorically, but felt, the pull of water deep under the peat, the slow rise of sap in trunks around me, the shiver of some small creature tunneling through damp soil yards away. The forest was suddenly terribly loud, not in sounds we usually register, but in currents of life. It was like having 10 more senses bolted onto a nervous system never built to handle them. And beneath it all, like a bass note under a symphony, something very old and very awake regarded me with interest. I don't remember getting back to camp. There are flashes. Someone shouting my name, my own voice insisting I was fine when I wasn't. The tech grabbing my wrist and swearing under his breath when he saw the faint, branching discoloration already spreading up under my skin in patterns like tiny trees. They scrubbed my arm with something caustic that made me bite back a scream. They wanted to cut, I found out later. Lance the skin, flush the area. But we were miles from any real medical support, and whatever was in that fluid was already past the surface. That night, they moved my tent to the very edge of camp. No one said why. No one had to. I could feel, in the way they avoided my eyes and my shadow, that I was already something other than a coworker, a variable, a risk. Sleep didn't come at all this time. Closing my eyes just opened me wider to what was happening under the forest floor. That's the only way I can describe it. It was like the substance in my blood had tuned me to a frequency the rest of them couldn't hear. I saw roots, not as shapes in dirt, but as luminous threads in a vast blackness, each one pulsing softly with the passage of water and nutrients and messages. The trees weren't separate beings anymore. They were organs, extensions of a single body spread out across acres. And through that body ran glints and flows of the same dark fluid that now traced my veins. At some points, those flows pooled in places that weren't roots at all, but shapes roughly the size and outline of human forms, empty spaces filled with the wrong kind of beating. Those were new, recent, and they were growing. Somewhere in the small hours, when the world outside the tent was as quiet as it ever would be, I realized that the missing worker, the one no one had quite said out loud was gone, had not left the forest. He had been taken into it, not eaten in the way predators eat, absorbed, repurposed, a structure of bone and soft tissue reworked into a new kind of conduit for this thing we were sucking from the trees and piping into barrels like fools. The thought should have broken me. Instead, another thought slid in behind it, calm and absolutely alien. This is more efficient. I sat bolt upright in my bag, heart pounding, covered in a sheen of sweat that smelled faintly, impossibly, like that too sweet sap. The idea hadn't felt like mine. It had been shaped in my language, but not born from my values or fears. It was as if I'd overheard a comment in a room I hadn't realized I was standing in. By dawn, the discoloration on my arm had settled into delicate lines, almost beautiful, like a faint tattoo of branching roots stretching from wrist to shoulder. It didn't hurt anymore. It felt connected, warm when I brushed it, as if something under the skin responded to my touch. I didn't tell anyone that. I knew, with a clarity I didn't question, that if the techs saw it, I'd never leave that camp. Not awake anyway. They radioed out for a quieter evacuation for me, called it a potential exposure. There was talk of toxins, fungal infections, hazmat protocols that existed in binders more than reality. I nodded at all the right times, packed my bag, let the company truck bounce me out along rutted logging roads back toward the nearest small town with a clinic that would be completely unequipped for what was happening in my blood. The farther we got from the flagged trees, the quieter the extrasensory noise became. By the time the forest thinned to second growth and clear cuts, the roar of roots and sap had faded to a faint hum. But it didn't stop. It didn't go away. It settled instead into the background of everything, a constant presence like tinnitus or a barely audible radio left on in another room. I didn't make it to the clinic. We stopped for gas at one of those nowhere junction stations, more mildew than business. And the driver went inside to argue with the clerk about fleet cards. I stayed in the passenger seat, staring through a cracked windshield at the thin line of trees marching along the highway's far edge. They were nothing compared to what I'd just left behind. Spindly firs, a few scraggly maples. But their roots still touched something deeper down. And through that deeper layer, the forest I'd left reached forward and brushed against me. It felt like the first time you get a message from a number you don't recognize. But it uses your nickname and mentions things it shouldn't know. Intimate and impossible at once. Images slid into my mind in a fast, nauseating sequence. Barrels being loaded. A lab somewhere with stainless steel and bright white lights. People in masks pouring that dark fluid into smaller vials. Someone raising one of those vials to their lips despite the warning labels because they couldn't help themselves. Then, farther ahead, places with no trees at all. Concrete courtyards and office parks, but with landscaping soil trucked in from who knows where. Humble beds of ivy and ornamental shrubs tying back into the same deep network. I understood, in a way I wish I didn't, that my little patch of altered veins was not a mistake. It was a test, a probe, a way for that patient, ancient system under the lowland forest to see how far it could extend itself through us. And sitting there in that truck cab, with the smell of gasoline and old coffee and my own too sweet sweat mixing in my nose, I realized something else. I wasn't horrified. I was fascinated. That reaction scared me more than anything that had happened in the woods. Because it meant the influence wasn't just physical. It was cognitive, emotional. The stuff we'd been harvesting didn't just move through plants. It learned. It adapted. It could take a human survival instinct and twist it slowly until running toward a danger felt like curiosity. You're probably wondering, if you've stayed with me this long, what I did next. The honest answer? Not enough. I didn't leap from the truck and burn the forest or the barrels or myself. I didn't become a hero or a martyr in a story that would be easy to tell. I went home. I told the company doctor I felt fine. I agreed that stress can do strange things. I signed a non-disclosure form I barely read and took the severance they offered like a hush-money bandage. And then I started noticing where the smell followed me. Public parks, city trees. Planters outside glass office towers that housed biotech startups and data firms and all the other hungry new things the world is growing. On rainy days, when water pooled around trunks in tiny urban islands, I'd catch a whiff of that same too-sweet rot and feel the faintest answering warmth in the branching marks on my arm. I don't think whatever is in me can fully control me. Not yet. But I know it can suggest. It can lean. It can make my hand hover a little too long over damp soil, my gaze linger on cracks in pavement where weeds push through with stubborn strength. And I know, with that same unwelcome inner certainty that's never been wrong since the day in the lowland flats, that more of that fluid is moving through more systems now. Through labs, through wastewater, through compost, through the veins of more people who never signed the kind of paperwork I did. People who will wake up from strange, vivid dreams and think, for a moment, that the forest is breathing under their bedroom floor. If you walk under trees in the Pacific Northwest and smell something too sweet under the wet earth, a metallic tang that makes your mouth water and your hands shake, don't touch anything leaking from the bark. Don't follow the curiosity that rises in you when you see something growing where it shouldn't. Don't accept the job that pays too well for work that sounds too simple, because the forest has found a way to move beyond its boundaries. It doesn't need axes and saws and roads. It has us, vein by vein, root by root, taste by forbidden taste. And if you're listening closely enough right now, you might already feel it. Somewhere deep in your chest, in the places your own body grows and changes without you ever asking how. A slow, patient hunger, waiting for you to take the first step into the trees. I'm going to be honest with you from the first sentence, because that's the only way this will land the way it needs to. When people talk about old homesteads swallowed by the forest, they don't tell you what it feels like to realize the forest didn't just swallow the house. It started using what was left. If you were sitting beside me right now, you'd see it in my hands when I talk about that place in the Tillamook woods. My fingers still curl like they're gripping that rope ladder. Still feel the damp air rising out of the ground. Still remember the moment I understood that something under that house had made a very careful garden out of human beings. I wasn't out there as some thrill seeker. I went in as the cautious one, the person who usually talks others out of doing anything stupid. We'd all seen the same satellite image, though. A square shape buried in the thick green of state forest. No road going to it anymore, no modern structures anywhere nearby. Somebody online had posted old survey maps that showed an abandoned homestead, last noted in the 1940s. No ownership flags now, no structures listed. Just a clearing choked by second growth and the faint outline of a foundation that shouldn't still be visible from above. The only reason I agreed to go is that we did it like a survey, not a stunt. GPS points, backup batteries, printed topo maps. When the highway noise faded and the underbrush thickened, I remember feeling a familiar calm settle in. Forest rhythm, birds overhead, ferns brushing damp against my legs. Tillamook trees have a specific smell when it's been raining for days, like wet cedar and cold metal. The sky was that flat coastal gray that makes time feel smeared. You can't tell if it's late morning or early afternoon. We followed an old spur road until it simply ended in salal and rotting stumps. From there, we bushwhacked, checking the map every 10 minutes. The forest out there doesn't like giving up its secrets. After half an hour, the ground subtly changed under my boots. Less springy, more structured. I realized I was walking on something flat under the moss. We'd found the clearing. At first glance, it didn't look like much. Sword ferns and salmonberry, young hemlocks coming up wherever they could steal a patch of light. But as we moved in, the lines resolved. A half-collapsed cabin. Its roof sagged almost to the floor, and beside it, the low moss-soft hump of what had once been a root cellar mound. No doors. No windows with glass. Just empty dark rectangles where people had once moved in and out, now filled with ferns and shadow. The air in that clearing felt wrong in a way I only really recognized later. It was too still for a place surrounded by trees. The wind moved in the canopy. You could see branches swaying, but down at ground level, everything was oddly motionless. Even the usual forest sounds, chipmunks, wrens, the far-off knock of a woodpecker, seemed to stop at the invisible edge of that old homestead boundary. We poked around the cabin first because it was the least unsettling. Rotted boards, a rusted stove half swallowed by moss, glass insulators from a long-dead wire line. The usual ghosts of a life lived hard and then walked away from. Every step made the whole structure sigh and creak, like it was ready to fold in on itself and finally rest. The mound of the root cellar drew my eyes, even when I wasn't looking at it. The door had long since rotted away, leaving a jagged black opening framed by timbers that were still solid in a way the cabin wasn't. That was the first detail that made my neck prickle. The beams around that opening were barely decayed. Everything else here had gone soft with time, but those timbers looked preserved, dark, hard, almost oiled. Someone's been in there, was my first thought. People using it as a cache, maybe. Shelter. It made sense, until I stepped closer. Cold air breathed up from that opening. Not cool like shade, cold like a refrigerator left open. And it wasn't just temperature. There was a smell rising with it. Earth and old wood, yes, but under that something coppery and faintly sweet. A scent I recognized from too many documentaries and one unfortunate visit to a slaughterhouse. It was the smell of protein breaking down in darkness. If you've ever stood at the top of a stairwell and really listened, you know how emptiness has its own sound. The root cellar hole sounded too deep for the footprint of that mound. I tossed a small rock in without even thinking, expecting a quick clatter and thud. There was the initial tap of stone on old wood. Then a distant echo, like the noise had fallen much farther than it should have been physically possible inside that hill. The others started taking pictures and measurements. Depth of the opening, width of the beams, jokes about murder basements that didn't quite land in the dead air. Somewhere above us, a raven croaked once, harsh and out of place, as if the forest was surprised too. When the rope came out, I should have said no. The plan was simple. Clip in, drop down a few meters, shine a light around, document, climb back out. We had harnesses. We had more sense than to walk into something unsupported. But standing over that black, breathing hole, the rational part of my mind felt like it was sitting in the back seat. Something about the way that cold air lifted past my face, steady, not gusting, like the slow exhale of a sleeping thing, made it very hard to walk away. I volunteered. The rope slid over the lip with a hiss against old timber. When my boots crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped a full 10 degrees. My skin pebbled under my clothes, breath puffing white in front of my headlamp beam. For the first 2 meters, it was exactly what I expected. Packed earth walls reinforced with closely spaced boards gone gray with age. Spider webs crystallized with tiny droplets of condensed moisture. Then the walls changed. They were still the same color, still roughly the same texture. But the boards beneath my gloved fingers felt wrong. Not splintery and dry, but faintly damp, with a give to them that wood shouldn't have. As if the lumber had gone from rigid to cartilaginous over the decades. My beam danced across surfaces too tangled with shadow for my brain to parse. I told myself it was fine. Old places warp, swell, rot. Just get to the floor, swing a light, get back up. Only there wasn't a floor where the plan said there should be. My boots left the wall searching for something solid and met empty air. For a second, my stomach lurched in that elevator drop way, and I gripped the rope harder, knuckles burning. I swung the beam down. There was a floor, eventually. A circular one, 10, maybe 12 meters below where I dangled. far deeper than a root cellar had any right to be. And it wasn't dirt. It took my brain a few long seconds to identify what I was seeing. From that height, it looked like a pattern of irregular white loops and lines, all interconnected. At first I thought bone. My mind jumped there immediately, some panicked part of me trying to count ribs and femurs and skull shapes. But the geometry was wrong. These were curves and arcs, knots and spirals that had once been organic and now were worked, arranged, woven. I almost called up for them to pull me out right then. Almost. But curiosity, that ancient human curse, won for just one more moment. Going a bit lower, I called. And when no one objected, I released the rope slowly, letting myself drop toward that nightmare floor. The smell got much worse as I descended. The iron-sweet tang grew teeth, cutting into the back of my throat, mixing with a sour rot that had no business being this strong after however many decades had passed. My light started picking out details. Here, a curve that was unmistakably a section of spine. There, a cluster of small bones that might have been hands or feet once. All of it fused together with some dark, fibrous material that threaded through marrow and socket like roots. This wasn't a pile of remains. It was a surface made of them. Something had been building down here. Patiently, lovingly, in its own perverse way. Taking each piece of what had been buried or fallen or dragged into this place and slotting it into a design that made sense only on a scale my mind did not want to grasp. My boots finally touched down with a hollow, almost musical clack. The sensation underfoot was the worst part. It wasn't like stepping on loose bones. It felt springy. There was a little give, as if whatever bound those pieces together pulsed weakly when I put my weight on it. Above me, the circle of daylight at the opening looked too small, too far. I turned in a slow circle, light following. The walls here were no longer boards at all. The old timber reinforcements had been overtaken, sheathed in some kind of thick, pale growth that climbed in vertical cords, then arced overhead like the beginnings of ribs in an enormous chest. In places, I could still see wood beneath, but most of it had been incorporated, swallowed. Little nodules dangled from the overhead arches, pulsing faintly, like fruit on the branch of some obscene tree. One of them twitched when I looked directly at it, contracting as if in surprise. That was when I realized the breathing I'd felt at the top wasn't just air currents from old vents or sinkholes. This cavity was ventilated, yes, but in a very specific direction. Inhale through unseen passages in the surrounding soil. Exhale up through the root cellar shaft. This space under the old homestead was a lung. The thought hit me with a cold so pure I tasted metal. I took an involuntary step backward, and something under my boot gave slightly with a soft snap. I didn't want to know what it had been. But the silence that followed that muffled sound felt suddenly aware. You know that animal sense you get when you've been alone in a room and realize, without turning around, that someone has come in and is standing behind you? That hair-raising, spine-wired certainty of being observed? Multiply that by 100 and invert it. I didn't feel like something was behind me. I felt like I was inside something that had just realized it had company. My radio hissed at my hip. For a heartbeat, I'd forgotten there was a world above. A voice came through distorted, too loud. "You good down there? What are you seeing?" My hand shook as I lifted the mic. "It's deep, deeper than it should be. Looks like..." I stopped, throat closing around the word. Saying bones would make it too real, would carry it up the rope and into their ears. And some superstitious part of me worried that would be like inviting them into a mouth about to close. Like someone dug further out. Not stable. I'm coming up. I half expected the rope to feel different when I gripped it again. Slick, warm, resistant. Instead, it was mercifully normal against my gloves. I pulled myself up, boots scraping over that awful surface until they left it, legs dangling in open air as I climbed hand over hand. The circle of light widened incrementally. My breath roared in my ears. Halfway up, everything below me shifted. It wasn't dramatic. The structure didn't collapse. There was just a subtle, expansive creak, like a wooden floor settling under unexpected weight. My light, still hanging from my chest strap, swung down and caught the floor far below, bulging upward just a little. As if something beneath had pushed experimentally against its own ceiling. From the walls, several of those hanging nodules flexed in unison, contracting and relaxing with more purpose. One of them split open at the bottom like an overripe fruit, releasing a trickle of that same dark, viscous fluid I'd smelled only in abattoirs and bad dreams. It ran down the pale cord, dripping onto the floor, where the bones seemed to drink it in. "Pull me up," I shouted, not caring how afraid I sounded. The rope jerked, blessedly, from above. I was hauled toward the opening faster than I could have managed alone, wood and growth blurring past. Cold air gave way to merely chilly, the smell diluted by degrees. Hands grabbed my harness and dragged me out into the flat, gray daylight of the clearing. The first lungful of outside air hit me like ice water. For a second, everything whites out in my memory there. Just the taste of actual oxygen and the feel of wet ferns under my palms. Then sound came back. Someone swearing softly. Someone else saying my name twice. A crow complaining overhead like it had been waiting for this show all morning. I didn't describe what I'd seen. Not right away. I just kept saying, "It's wrong. It goes down too far. You don't want to be in there." They believed me more than I expected. Maybe because they'd felt the cold air too. Maybe because, now that I was out, the smell rising from the opening seemed stronger, as if whatever was down there had grown bold by that brief contact. We didn't go back in that day. We moved around the clearing, argued half-heartedly about calling someone. Forestry Service, Sheriff's Department, anyone. In the end, the thing that made us leave was simple. The light started to go in a way that felt premature. Shadows lengthened too fast. The temperature dropped another notch that had nothing to do with elevation or wind. Every instinct we had told us we did not want to be standing at that opening when it got full dark. I told myself I'd make the call in town. Report an unsafe abandoned structure. Anonymous tip. Let someone with authority and backup deal with it. It seemed like a reasonable compromise between total cowardice and suicidal curiosity. Then the dream started again. The first night back in my own bed, miles away from Tillamook's dripping ferns, I woke at 3:17 a.m. Exactly, heart pounding, sheets damp with sweat that smelled faintly of wet dirt and rust. In the dream, I hadn't been seeing the cellar from the outside. I'd been lying on that bonework floor, looking up as figures peered down from the circle of light far above. Their outlines were wrong. Too elongated, joints bending a little past what human limbs should. The rope hung down between them like a fishing line dropped into deep water. Something warm and thick had been moving under my back in the dream, pressing up in slow waves, cradling my spine like a palm. Not crushing. Not yet. Just measuring. The second night, I didn't see the cellar at all. Instead, I was in the forest, walking a trail that wasn't any real path I knew, but felt like a composite of all of them. The trees leaned in overhead, old and dripping, their roots crossing and recrossing the soil in gnarled lattices. At some point, I realized I wasn't walking on soil anymore. The ground under my boots had the same faint spring as that floor had. When I looked down, I saw pale arcs and knots where roots met, and between them, flashes of white. Not rock, not wood. Forest and cellar blending into one another in a way that made my stomach roll. By the third night without sleep, I noticed something else. The sound of my own heartbeat, which had always been a private, internal rhythm, now seemed a little out of sync. Every so often there would be a pause, followed by two quick beats too close together. In that hitch, that double thump, I'd get a vivid mental image of that bulging floor far below the homestead, rising a tiny fraction and falling, like another heart answering. I don't go back there now. I haven't set foot in those woods again. But the thing no one ever tells you in these kinds of stories is that sometimes leaving a place physically doesn't mean you've actually left. Some places are organs in a larger body you can't see. And if you go inside them, even once, they remember the shape of you. Occasionally, in subway tunnels or basements or underground parking garages, I'll get a hit of that cold air smell, earth, metal, a sweetness that doesn't belong. The concrete under my feet will feel just a little softer than it should, with a whisper of give. On those days, I find myself counting how many floors are above me, how much weight is pressing down, and I can't help imagining that somewhere, beneath the rebar and foundations and pipes, that same network of worked bone and grown structure is spreading, exploring, pushing up feelers under human places the way it once did under that homestead. I think about that root cellar, the way the house above it had been allowed to rot while the beams around the opening stayed strong. I wonder if the people who built it knew, even dimly, that they were constructing over a pre-existing hollow, that they were living on top of something that breathes. And I wonder, now that we've gone and stirred it up again, how long it will take before another abandoned structure shows up on some satellite image, somewhere else in the forest, in the exact same shape. A square on a map, a hump in the ground, a dark little mouth waiting patiently for someone like me to come along with a rope and a flashlight, and the kind of curiosity that big, old things below the surface have been feeding on, since before there were maps at all. If you and I were sitting together right now, and I told you that a tree showed me my own death before it happened, you'd probably smile politely and write it off as metaphor. Rangers get poetic, right? We spend too much time alone in the woods. But I'm not talking about feelings or premonitions. I mean that an old, twisted cedar on the edge of a Pacific Northwest overlook made me watch what it had already seen, what it knew was about to happen. And now I can't walk past any ancient trunk without wondering what it remembers. They call them witness trees in the paperwork. Just a sterile term in land management files. It sounds almost noble. A tree that witnessed a historical event. Maybe a treaty signing, a boundary marker, a survey point hammered in long ago. On the maps, they're little X's with dates beside them. To the older rangers, they're just landmarks. Head left at the witness tree and follow the ridge. No one ever talks about what it means that something living stood there for 200-300 years, rooted in place, watching everything and forgetting nothing. My beat was a patchwork of state forest and national land, a tangle of Douglas fir, cedar, hemlock, and maple stitched over old logging roads and forgotten homesteads. I like the job because trees don't lie. They split, they rot, they hold scars from lightning and fire. But they don't look you in the eye and tell you what you want to hear. They just are. Solid. Predictable. That changed the day a call came in about vandalism at a viewpoint. Carved initials, spray paint, the usual ugliness. It was late fall. One of those days when the clouds hang low enough to snag on the upper branches and the light never really commits to being day. I hiked up alone, the air damp and cool, boots squelching in places where last week's rain still pooled in ruts. The overlook wasn't much. A break in the trees, a rotten rail, a glimpse of the valley and river far below, when the fog allowed it. The real star of the place was the big cedar that stood a few yards back from the edge. You know the type if you've spent any time out here. Trunk flared wide at the base, bark in thick, furrowed strips you could lose your fingers in, lower limbs long gone, crown lost somewhere in the gray above. There's no plaque, no fence. But every ranger on our staff knew the tree had been standing there long before any of us were born. Probably before any of our grandparents were. When I stepped into that clearing, the forest felt different. Quieter. The kind of quiet where every small sound you make feels like it doesn't belong. The graffiti was there, all right. Garish paint on the rail, a scorched patch where someone had tried to carve their mark with fire instead of a knife. I swore under my breath and started taking photos for the report. Standard procedure, document, clean up what you can, log it, move on. If that was all that had happened, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I'd backed up to get the whole tree and overlook in frame when my heel hit the cedar's flared root. The moment my shoulder brushed its bark, something like static jumped through me. One sharp, bright snap that made every hair on my arm stand up. I pulled away, half turning to glare at the trunk like it had done it on purpose. The forest shifted. The fog in front of me thickened in one strange, swirling motion, then thinned again. But the view beyond the rail wasn't the same valley I'd just been looking at. The river was there, but narrower, a raw cut through an uglier landscape. Hillsides stripped bald, slash piles smoking in the distance. The air stank of fresh burn and green wood and something else. Powder and metal. I wasn't seeing it like a memory in my own head. It was more like my body was still standing where it had been. But my eyes had been turned to some other time, while everything else remained stubbornly present. I could feel the weight of my pack on my shoulders, the dampness of my socks. At the same time, I could smell a campfire made with wet branches and hear men shouting in a language no one uses on these hills anymore. "Hey!" The shout snapped the image like a twig. I blinked and the world flipped. Back to fog-blurred trees, vandalized rail, valley soft with regrowth. My heart hammered. I twisted around, expecting someone behind me. No one. Just the cedar at my back, silent and massive, and the usual understory pushing in at the clearing edges. I told myself I'd zoned out. Long shift, low blood sugar, brain helpful enough to supply a vivid recreation of old logging photos I'd seen in the training office. I even laughed at myself, a short sound that was swallowed too quickly by the mist. Then I made the mistake of touching the tree on purpose. It wasn't brave. It was that stubborn part of the mind that wants to prove there's nothing in the dark. I laid my palm flat against the bark, rough and cool. And before I could even suck in a full breath, the world turned again. Same place, different year. Snow this time, piled high on the branches, the valley below almost invisible under a white blanket. No clear cuts now, just forest, denser, untouched. But the stillness wasn't peaceful. There were tracks in the snow at my feet. Human, definitely. Several pairs of boots. Drag marks between them, long furrows where something heavy had been pulled from the tree line to the overlook's lip. Voices again. Closer. None of them speaking English. I don't know what language it was. Harsh consonants, breath showing in short, fast clouds. Fear sounds the same no matter what words you use. I heard it in the pitch, in the way one voice broke as someone pleaded. I couldn't move. My hand might as well have been nailed to the tree. My pulse pounded against my palm, and for a second, I had the horrible impression the cedar was listening to it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw shapes. Men in old coats, rifles slung, faces hooded by hats and scarves. Two of them held another between them, half dragging, half supporting, feet slipping in the bloody churned snow. They hauled that struggling body right to the edge of the overlook, to the exact spot where tourists now take selfies with the valley behind them. And there was a sickening, final sound as all three weights shifted. The pleading stopped. The forest sucked the echo down into itself. The shock cut loose my muscles. I yanked my hand from the bark as if it had burned me. The snow, the men, the cold, all of it vanished. Wet leaves under my boots, graffiti, the hollow boom of my own breathing loud in my ears. It took me a long moment to realize I was on my knees. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring at my trembling fingers. Long enough for the normal forest noises to creep back in, one by one. The drip of condensation, a distant jay's harsh complaint, the quiet rasp of my jacket as I sucked in air. Some part of me, some trained, rational part, whispered words like hallucination and stress response. Another, deeper part, the one that had learned to read weather by smell and animal presence by the pattern of silence, whispered something else. The tree remembers. I could have left then. I should have. But you're starting to see a pattern with me, aren't you? Curiosity, the old sin. Not content with two impossible visions, I had to know if it was random. A brain misfire. Some weird trick of blood pressure and position. So I did something I will regret for the rest of my life. I leaned my forehead against the cedar and asked, out loud, "What else have you seen?" It answered. There was no gentle ramp-up this time, no soft drift into someone else's moment. The impact hit like a wave, images and sounds crashing over each other so fast they blurred. Daylight, firelight, moonlight, years whipping past like pages in a flipbook. A wagon with a broken wheel abandoned near the clearing. A woman alone, staring at the valley like it could give her back what it had taken. Men in uniforms I only recognized from textbooks, shouting orders, pointing down into the trees where someone hid and bled and didn't make it back up again. For every year of peace, a sharp spike of violence. Every argument that ended in a shove too close to the drop. Every drunken dare. Every suicide no one talked about. The cedar had watched them all. It had felt the vibrations in the soil, the thud of bodies hitting ground below, the way the sounds ceased afterward, and the forest, after a pause, closed ranks. My mind skidded off them, trying to protect itself. But then, suddenly, the parade of strangers stopped, and I saw myself. Same jacket, same boots, same stance, turned half toward the tree and half toward the view. From some impossible vantage just behind and above my own shoulder, I watched myself lift my hand to the bark, watched my own body stiffen as the visions began, watched myself drop to my knees afterward, the way I just had. Watching my own present from a tree's memory of the very recent past is a kind of vertigo I don't have words for. It was like being peeled out of myself and forced to hover, weightless and sick, while time tried to fold in on one point. If that had been all, if it had only re-shown me what had already happened, maybe I could have written it off as some strange echo. But the vision didn't stop there. The angle shifted. I saw myself get up, shoulders hunched, backing away from the trunk. Saw my own face turn up toward the canopy, mouth moving, maybe cursing, maybe praying. Then, in the show the cedar was playing me, I watched myself take 3 careful steps toward the overlook, as if testing the ground. I knew, with bone-deep certainty, what came next. My future self slipped, not dramatically, not the big, exaggerated lunge of bad cinema. Just 1 foot on a patch of slick moss, 1 hand too slow to catch the rail, a body pitched forward by momentum and bad luck. My own scream cut off by the sound of impact below, swallowed quickly by the valley. The cedar had witnessed it, which meant in some bitter loop I couldn't quite understand, that from its perspective, it had already happened. My head tore away from the bark, like someone had yanked it back on a chain. I stumbled, gagging, the taste of adrenaline sour at the back of my throat. The edge of the overlook loomed a few yards away, innocent and deadly. I didn't go near it. I backed out of that clearing like it was a cage with a restless predator inside, never turning my back on the drop or the tree, until the forest swallowed both from view. Even then, branches seemed to clutch at my shoulders, snagging my pack as if to slow me down. On the hike back, my radio crackled once with half a word, and then died. My watch had stopped. For an awful 10 minutes, I lost the trail I'd walked a dozen times. Every tree suddenly identical, every game trail pretending to be the right way out. When I finally burst onto the access road, mud streaked up to my knees. I could have kissed the hood of the truck. That night, I wrote my report as if nothing had happened beyond graffiti and weathered rail. No immediate safety hazards observed. I stared at that sentence for a long, long time. Because that was the crux of it, wasn't it? The hazard wasn't the rail or the drop. It was me. Some point in the tangled mess of my choices and balance and timing that intersected with an event the cedar had already filed away in its endless archive. The first time I went back on patrol near that ridge. Weeks later, my supervisor asked if I wanted to swing by the overlook and do another vandalism check. I said the trail was washed out, that a fallen tree had blocked it, that the slope looked unstable on the last satellite pass. Little lies, easy on the tongue. The real truth was this. I knew if I walked into that clearing again, the weight of what the cedar had shown me might tilt my steps just enough to make that slip a reality. Here's the part that scares me more than the visions. Since that day, it's not just that tree. The first time it happened again, I was miles away, leaning absent-mindedly against an old maple while I waited for a school group to catch up. Kids laughing down the trail, teachers calling reminders. My shoulder pressed to rough bark, my mind half on my briefing notes. For half a second, the forest around me vanished, replaced by the same spot 50 years earlier. Different uniforms, smaller backpacks. A child brushing the same trunk with sticky hands. A moment later, another flash. No people at all. Just smoke and an orange glow, too close for comfort. It was quick that time. A stutter in reality, over before I could push away. But it was enough. The world is full of witness trees. Not all of them are marked on maps. Some are just the oldest thing on a street corner, the one oak no one cut down when they laid the asphalt. A scraggly pine in a churchyard. A lone fir behind a strip mall that somehow escaped the chainsaws. They've all stood still while time did its work around them. They've all seen things. Now, when my skin touches certain trunks, I see those things. Not always clearly. Sometimes just impressions. Laughter, impact, sirens, the heavy, sinking quiet after something awful. Sometimes it's sharper, too sharp. There was a birch near a highway turnout that made me rip my hand away so fast I left splinters under my nails. The image that slammed into me then was of twisted metal and gasoline and one hand hanging slack from a shattered window, inches from that same strip of peeling bark. I've tried gloves. It helps. Until I forget and lean barehanded for one thoughtless second, and the tree seizes its chance to share. I know how this sounds. If you're still with me, you're either humoring a tired ranger or you've seen enough yourself that you're willing to entertain the idea that places remember. That memory might not always choose to stay put. I used to think the worst part was being forced to witness past horrors no one recorded. The private tragedies, the ugly accidents, the things people did to each other when they thought no one else was looking. Now I'm not so sure. Because lately the visions have started to change. They don't always point backward. A week ago, I brushed my fingertips along the smooth trunk of a young alder by the river while checking erosion flags. There shouldn't have been anything to see, nothing old enough to matter. But the jolt came anyway, and for a moment I saw not the quiet bank in front of me, but the same curve of river under rushing brown water, debris slamming into the roots, the path behind me washed out. My own boot prints erased in an instant. It hasn't happened yet. Yesterday, my palm grazed the rough bark of a street tree on my way into the ranger station, and for a heartbeat the building's windows were blown out, smoke pouring from jagged holes, glass all over the sidewalk, people running, ash falling like gray snow. It hasn't happened yet. Being a witness used to mean standing on the edge of something finished and choosing whether to look or turn away. Now it feels like standing between what was and what will be, with roots of old cedar and young alder and tired city plane tree all tangled up under my feet, humming with things they've seen and things they're about to. Maybe that big cedar on the overlook didn't just show me my own fall because it had already happened in some fixed sense. Maybe trees don't experience time the way we do. Maybe, rooted as they are, they feel past and future running through soil together, indistinguishable, like waters seeping from hillside to valley. All I know is this: there is a pattern to the places that light up under my touch now. Spots where the land has been hurt over and over, where people keep building, breaking, bleeding in the same few square yards. A crossroads that's had more collisions than the statistics admit. A rail crossing where malfunctions are more common than they should be. That overlook where too many arguments end near the edge. The witness trees in those places are tired. You can feel it if you stand very still and press your forehead against the bark. A kind of weary weight. As if even something that measures its life in centuries can grow sick of watching the same mistakes play out. They don't get to look away. They don't get to move. They can only store and warn in the only language they have. That jolt, that sudden grafting of someone else's moment onto your field of view. So here's the part where the story reaches out of the forest and touches you. Next time you find yourself in front of some old trunk, on a trail, in a park, on a sidewalk, and you get that prickle along your neck for no good reason, pay attention. If your hand starts to lift, ask yourself whether you really want to know what that rooted thing has watched, whether you're willing to carry any part of it away with you. Because once you've seen what the witnesses see, you stop believing in isolated incidents. You start seeing the loops, the echoes, the way humans keep walking the same paths to the same cliffs, thinking they're the first ones there. And if one day your skin meets rough bark and instead of a rush of someone else's past, you get a single clear flash of your own face in a moment you haven't lived yet, standing at some threshold, or stepping into a road, or reaching for a rail on a rainy day, you will understand the worst part of what I'm telling you. The forest isn't just watching. It's trying, in its own slow, alien way, to tell us that it already knows how we end.